Pleasure to be here. As you know, libertarians often love to be contrarians. I'm sure that we have a lot of people in this room who are endorsing some pretty crazy ideas out there, right? Whether it's about 3D printing guns or abolishing the Fed, we are often stating some very unpopular opinions. So I hope you don't mind if I start this conversation by stating some unpopular opinions that are prevalent in free market circles, because I'm going to talk about why us classical liberals and libertarians should be endorsing some of our lefty friends. So rather than continuing on the path of fusionism, I would like to have a conversation with you about why I think it's important to create new political alliances and what the left can play when it comes to building a freer and more prosperous future. And I promise I don't just do it to upset you and to raise your blood pressure on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm doing it because I believe that classical liberals and libertarians do need to change their path if we want to remain relevant for the future. I'm not talking about the core theoretical foundations of classical liberalism or libertarianism. I don't want to change Mises to Marx, but I'm talking about the practicalities, about how we make our ideas relevant and how we actually impact political life today. And maybe I'm biased because I spent most of my life in the bureaucratic bubble of Brussels. So a lot of my engagement is with politicians, with members of the European Parliament, and I can promise you that they think very, very differently to us, right? If a politician sees a problem, then they want to address it through legislation, they want to have more power, and that they hope that through that they will be able to impact some positive change. Us classical liberals, we are exactly the opposite. We see a problem and we point immediately to the government and blame the government for every misfortune. And obviously, I think we are more right than the politicians, but nevertheless, if we actually want to impact policy and if we want to have a broader societal impact, we do need some political alliances. And for better or worse, these political alliances have been rather with the conservatives in the past and not with the lefties. You know that libertarians are not yet running the word. I hope that may change in the future. But I think we did some tremendous progress over the last 50 years. If you look at the word today compared to 50 years ago, we live in a much, much better state of affairs. And I think that's because often libertarians and classical liberals made some hard political compromises and impacted policy and politics accordingly. And I want to talk a little bit about the past, a little bit about how we impacted this. And in order to predict the useful political alliances of the future, I think it is really worth looking at the history. And you may know some of the classical liberal thinkers, and one of my favorite historians, Dr. Steve Davies, who is one of my colleagues at the IE, who came up with the idea of political realignment. And I think this whole idea is incredibly important because it gives us a good prediction for the future. So let me quickly walk through the history of political realignment and how we imagine the future to happen accordingly. So according to the idea of political realignment, according to Steve Davies, there was one main thing, one political identifying factor that really mattered for the last 50 years. And that was the idea how much government should be involved when it comes to economic redistribution. So you were more left-wing if you wanted to have a bigger role for the state when it comes to economic redistribution, and you were more right-wing if you wanted to limit the role of the state when it comes to redistribution. But there was also secondary political identity. And the secondary political identity, the roles were exactly reversed. It was all about enforcing morality through the state. And there it was the left-wing political actors that wanted to limit the role of the state when it comes to enforcing morality. And it was the right-wing conservative forces that really wanted to have a say in how you live your personal life. So you may actually ask, how do libertarians fit into the picture, right? We're both against state intervention when it comes to the economy, but we are very much against state intervention when it comes to enforcing political morality. Well, I think the reality was that despite Hayek's famous essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, we were a lot more aligned with the conservative political parties simply because the primary political identifying factor was all about economics. So it made sense for us to team up with the conservatives and try to impact change in the world accordingly. I think that's why Milton Friedman, he was traveling the world and advising right-wing conservative governments. If you look at my institution, the Institute of Economic Affairs, they were kind of the main source for the Thatcherite reforms, again, a conservative governing force. And also, if you look at a lot of the other American politicians, if you look at Justin Amash, if you look at Rand Paul or Ron Paul, maybe formerly they were more libertarian than nowadays, but they were all sitting in the Republican Party rather than the Democratic one. And I think that's all because the primary political identifying factor, it was all about economics. But if you're looking around politics today, you see some very big changes and some big political infighting. If you actually look over to the United States, a lot of the supporters of AOC seem to be hating on the Biden administration more than they hate the former Trump government or that they hate the Republicans. If you look here in Europe, if you look at the three largest economies of the EU and Germany and France and Italy, new political parties have taken over the governments. They are running these countries either by themselves or in coalition. Christian Democrats are often replaced by national conservative political forces. Social Democrats are often replaced by Green parties, or worse, far-left governments and far-left political forces. So there is a lot of political change happening right now. And I think if the world is changing around us, it's quite important for us to be able to adopt as much as possible. And that's why I want to walk you through how the political realignment should influence our alliances in the future. Because in practice, it means that the primary political identifying factor, thanks to political realignment, it ceased to be about economics. It's not the economic redistribution that matters the most anymore, and it was replaced by a question of societal openness. And societal openness, according to Steve, is defined as your attitude towards supranational institutions, your attitude towards globalization, towards kind of open societies with no major limits on trade or immigration. So on one end of the spectrum, you have people and political parties that are very much against multiculturalism, for the protection of national sovereignty, basically arguing to maintain the kind of national sovereignty, the big role of nation states in the future. They can be left or right-wing from an economic perspective, because that kind of political identities shifted accordingly. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the forces that are more pro-globalization, that are more pro-societal openness. You can call them globalists if you like. I wouldn't mind myself identifying as globalist. But I think it's important to remember that not every globalist is necessarily a classical liberal or libertarian. My primary example would be the French president, Emmanuel Macron. I think he's very much a politician who thinks in global terms. He would be happy to set up tax agreements, essentially global cartels for states, limiting national sovereignty in that way. He's very much pro-EU, he's engaged with the United Nations, but I definitely would not call him a classical liberal. So again, globalists are not necessarily classical liberals. But you remember that there is usually also a secondary political identifying factor, and I think, in agreement with Steve Davies, that the secondary political identifying factor is now the question of economic redistribution. So it still very much matters what you think about taxation, what you think about the role of government when it comes to spurring growth, but it's not the most important question anymore. And this is bad news for quite a lot of classical liberals, right? Because we live in an era where still taxation is incredibly high, regulatory burdens are slowing down the growth of the economy. We still very much want to engage with economic topics, but when it comes to political campaigns and the reality of societies caring about big issues, it's really not economic issues that are going to be at the forefront for the next 40 years. So if our fusionist attitude worked with the conservatives in the past, then how should it look for the future? And before I outline some of my ideas on that, I would want to share a couple of words about why I think this is necessary at the moment. I don't think you can see, maybe at the end of the room, how the graph looks like, but this is an index that our Swedish member think tank creates every second year that assesses every single parliamentary election in Europe since 1980. And the Timber Authoritarian Populism Index essentially outlines that both the left-wing and right-wing extreme authoritarian forces have been growing in popularity over the last 20 years. And this is definitely bad news for us. I know that there are some in the libertarian circles who believe that because some of these populist governments are very much critiquing the status quo and they are fighting against the kind of political corruption that's often prevalent in a lot of countries, that maybe because the enemy of our enemy may be our friend, it's worth engaging with them, but I don't think that is the case. So if we actually align ourselves with these conservative forces that are going more and more in a national conservative direction rather than a free market direction, I think it will harm the cause of classical liberalism in the future. And these political parties are not just winning seats in parliaments, but they're often at the governing table of many countries themselves. So if you look at the graph behind me, you will see how many right-wing authoritarian parties are in governing coalitions in Europe at the moment. And it's a lot. 11 European countries have an authoritarian government or an authoritarian party within the government. And that's definitely not good news for classical liberals. If you think private property is an important pillar of a free society, then I wouldn't want to be a small entrepreneur in Viktor Orban's Hungary because your right to private property is not going to be acknowledged. If you're an atheist, I wouldn't want to be in Kaczynski's Poland, although at least we see some silver linings of change in Poland. So just because conservatives are in power, it doesn't mean that the libertarian fusionism can easily continue in the future. And let's assume that the whole idea of Steve Davies about political realignment is correct. What this graph really shows behind us is that a lot of the people voting for these populist parties, they're not voting for them because what they say on the economy. They're voting for them because what they say about open societies, how they approach immigration, how they approach global alliances, the European Union, and their classical liberals and these new national conservative forces are very much adrift. So if we can't rely on conservatives as our main political allies anymore, where should we look? I think libertarians can often feel very lonely, that most of the societies in Europe do disagree with our ideas, libertarianism is not mainstream as of yet, but as the world has proven over the last 50 years, with the right political alliances and with the right political attitudes, we can still very much positively impact change. So I'm going to run through 3 different topics where I think it's very much possible to engage with left-leaning political forces and build maybe some new long-term political alliances that are different to the conservative libertarian fusionism. And I want to start with a controversial one, environmentalism. I think this is an extremely tricky topic. There is a lot of high emotions around it, from Greta Thunberg's attitude of running around like headless chicken and panicking about the whole situation, to a lot of politicians saying for the last 40 years already that, oh, we only have 10 years to live unless we change our ways drastically. Environmentalism is very much an emotional issue, and I get that. We all want to live in healthy, decent environments on a planet that's going to be around for the long term. But I think environmentalism gives classical liberals such a positive opportunity to talk about the role of innovation and the role of entrepreneurs in changing the world. Even today, if you're looking at various agriculture sectors, from lab-grown meats to vertical farms, there is very much a pro-market classical liberal story to tell when it comes to adapting to climate change and positively influencing the market economy in that regard. So focusing on the positives and essentially endorsing almost like a climate message, but through classical liberal means, I believe it's very much possible. But I'm also very much a political realist. So if I would be offered by some left-wing governments a tit-for-tat in taxation, essentially saying that, yes, we want to implement a wide-ranging CO2 tax on all sorts of products, but in exchange, reduce overall corporate tax rates, I think we should very much engage in these type of political compromises. So a tit-for-tat in taxation and more emphasis on the positive contributions of innovation and entrepreneurship when it comes to environmentalism, it's definitely possible. And I'm afraid in this front, it's going to be very difficult to work together with the political forces that are more national sovereigntists, simply because climate change is very much a global issue. So this is only possible to do if you are happy to work within supranational institutions and kind of drop the one nation idea of change, simply because that's just not going to be enough. And on this front, I think left and green parties are more willing to engage than some of the conservative forces. The second topic is housing. I'm aware that I'm not talking to a UK audience, so maybe this is somewhat less convincing for you guys. Maybe the housing crisis in Czechia is better than what we are experiencing in London. But housing is very much a classical libertarian issue where we are in total disagreement with conservative ideas. If you look at the United Kingdom, where I live, it's really old, mostly conservative homeowners that want to stop any kind of progress when it comes to new house building. And as a result, we have skyrocketing prices, rents are going up double digits every single year. And then you have a very, very young, resentful population that essentially blames capitalism and the free markets for the failings of government-enforced NIMBYism. So I'm not saying that it's going to be an easy ride with left-wings or left-wingers when it comes to house building. A lot of left-wing individuals want to have the state build the houses rather than private corporations. But I think the end goals are much more similar with a lot of the left-leaning individuals compared to the conservatives. Left-leaning YIMBYs, so yes in my backyard people, are a lot more prevalent than conservative YIMBYs. Conservatives tend to be the not in my backyard people stopping a lot of these property developments. So housing, again, very much an issue where I can easily believe that there will be a lot of collaboration with non-conservative political parties in the future. Last but not least, immigration. I think this is an extremely controversial topic. I'm well aware that this has been one of the main reasons for the rise of national conservatism, not just here in Europe, but over in the US as well. But I think on this front, we have a much better chance of working with left, liberal, and green political parties to have reasonably open borders, reasonably free immigration systems, unlike what is currently happening both in the EU and the United States. And when it comes to immigration, I'm well aware that this is not just an economic question. I think most people in this room would very much agree that the economic benefits of freer immigration are definitely there, but they worry about some of the cultural impacts. And I'm not gonna lie, I totally get that. I live in East London. A couple of weeks ago, when the terrible atrocities happened in Israel, some of my Muslim neighbors decided to set up fireworks and celebrate the attacks. So I'm not saying that every single immigration policy is going to be easy or there are no trade-offs. But I think if you look at the overall picture, immigration is very much a positive story, both economically and from a societal perspective. If you look at all the refugees leaving Cuba or Venezuela, they very much understand how socialism and state control harms societies. If you look at Afghani or Iranian refugees to Europe, they very much understand how a theocratic, religious, authoritarian government can harm their freedoms. So I think we can rely on a lot of entrepreneur-minded, motivated immigrants searching for a better life when it comes to building free societies. And I'm not going to share any big news with you that conservatives are not going to be our main allies on this front. I think most conservative political parties in Europe very much moved towards the right when it comes to limiting immigration, and we have much, much better chances to work with social democratic, green, or liberal parties when it comes to building a more open immigration system. So these are the three policy areas where I think we do have a decent chance of positively working together with non-conservative political forces. But you might think very well that, yes, sure, these are areas where collaboration is possible, but it's still conservative political parties that want to cut taxes. It's still conservative political parties that want to cut red tape and spur economic growth. It's still conservative political parties that don't want you to use politically correct speech and control free speech. So really, don't we actually have more in common with conservatives than with social democrats or greens? And it wouldn't be a bad point. I think I would agree with that sort of criticism in some regards. And that's why I'm not proposing the complete abandonment of alliances with conservative forces, conservative parties in the future. But I think just like you would very much diversify your financial portfolio, classical liberals and libertarians do need to diversify their political allies in the future. How do we do that? I think we need to be a lot more open-minded when it comes to engaging with political parties and political movements that we don't necessarily like. I think we can occasionally be a bit too arrogant and too self-assured about our own ideas. So I would very much recommend that you guys are here because of Students for Liberty, an extremely young crowd with the whole future ahead of you, engaging with people and ideas that you may disagree with in an open-minded, positive manner, I think enables us to build more and wider political alliances in the future. So do what you're already doing, engage with SFL, engage with all these political movements and ideas, and well, keep on fighting the good fight. And I hope that as a result, our next 50 years are going to be just as impactful and positive as the last 50 years were. Thank you very much.